Prior to that, we had a reasonable amount of certainty about what you could and couldn't do with data. But since that date, since the implementation of GDPR, things have been a little bit different, and we had to learn to deal with a bit more ambiguity, should we say. Now, it's a common joke amongst our colleagues and other sort of people that work in compliance that you start any answer to a question about data protection with, it depends, okay? Because it so much now is subjective as opposed to just, hard answers. So we kick off with GDPR, okay? GDPR is the principal piece of data protection legislation that we have in the UK, initially implemented in the EU, but now written into UK law. It's a principles-based piece of legislation, which means that you have a lot of variation in the way that it's interpreted. There's very little case law out there at the moment, and what case law there is often in a state of being appealed. Okay, so even though you might have heard about a company being fined in a particular way, that might be under appeal with another section of court. There are many different interpretations, and sometimes these differing interpretations are perfectly genuine. What one company does with data might be completely different to another one, and their interpretation of the use of certain aspects of GDPR might be, perfectly legitimate. But it's been very difficult for businesses who grew up under the old regime of the Data Protection Act to sort of force their processing activities into the new structure created by GDPR. And there have been a number of large cases that have built on this because you're trying to fit an old business practice into a new legal regime, and that caused a lot of confusion for a lot of organisations. But GDPR isn't the only piece of legislation that we have. Of course, we have the PECRA, which is the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations. Now, the problem with PECRA is that it's massively out of date. Okay? It was supposed to be updated at the same time as GDPR, but that never happened. And ever since then, it's been going through the EU lawmaking process at a very slow rate. Every so often, a new version of the text will come up, and then it's instantly shot down. So, after a while, I stopped reading all these different versions, and now I'm just waiting for the final one. But before that happened, of course, we left the EU. So it's not clear what's going to happen with a piece of EU legislation when it does eventually come in. The legislation in the EU is currently in the stage of trilogue, which means that they're sort of like finalising the definitive final version of the text of the new piece of legislation, and probably be 6 months. And there may well be a 2-year implementation period to follow that. That will affect the UK is not at the moment. Obviously, one of the big that looks after is the use of cookies, and you will notice that there's been a lot of talk about cookies and some pieces of technology and the way they've been used recently, and all of it is good news. So on top of the pieces of legislation, which of course we all have to do our best to abide by, there are other things out there that are making it rather confusing for marketers and people who process a lot of data. ISO published a draft direct marketing code of practice 2 years ago now, and it's sat in a draft for that long, and we're still not totally sure when the final is going to be published. My last conversation with the ICO suggested that it'll be sometime this year, right? So again, this creates a lot of uncertainty because we've got the draft code, and anybody can go and look at the draft code, and it's got a number of things in that code that industry doesn't really agree with, right? And that's the point of a consultation, is that industry can give its feedback, and then a final version will be laid out. But of course, people are in this funny position at the moment where they don't know, well, should we comply with what's in the draft code, because that's obviously what the ICO are intending to put into place, or do we just carry on doing what we're doing and wait for the final version? As well as the ICO's code of practice, which will actually have a legal standing. Codes of practice issued by regulators like the ICO have a legal definition. We also have industry codes. So within GDPR, there is the ability for groups of data controllers, usually trade associations like the DMA, to create their own industry codes to address very parts of GDPR. And this is something that the DMA is doing at the moment. We're trying to create a code and get that approved by the ICO so that members and non-members in the data and marketing space can sign up to our industry code to say that they are compliant with GDPR. This is that obviously as a company you can show customers or people that you deal with that you do come up to the standard required by the ICO, but it also allows the ICO to delegate an amount of responsibility to the code owner. So complaints that came in against people that had signed up to an industry code will be dealt with by that code owner and not by the ICO. And a lot of people see that as quite a positive thing because dealing with the ICO can be quite hard work sometimes. Now, I mentioned this at the beginning, but there's also an awful lot of enforcement going on and various investigations which are also affecting people's confidence about the way they use data. We've seen a number of enforcement cases in Europe where Google and the likes of Facebook get fined massive amounts. But most recently, and the thing that will probably affect most people, is IAB Europe and their transparency and control framework that is used by most people when it comes to online advertising has been deemed not compliant with GDPR. So that puts people in a very awkward position. All of the large organizations that do online advertising are now aware that the regulators think the system that they're using is not compliant. But there isn't really an alternative at the moment and is under appeal. Okay, so everybody's sitting in a kind of funny limbo at the moment, not really knowing what to do with their online advertising. Another example is the company Experian. I imagine anybody's heard of Experian. They had enforcement action taken against them by the ICO probably about 18 months ago now. And again, that is all under appeal. And that's very much having an impact on the use of third-party data. A lot of people use third-party data, obviously, for new customer acquisition, but also for other things like profiling products, like Mosaic or Personics and kind of thing, or also just adding data from a third-party supplier to the data that you already have to enrich your current data supply. So third-party data is a vital source of information for all marketers and people that process data, and that all of that is, I don't want to say under threat, but it's kind of like in the air moment while this enforcement action takes place with the ICO. So as well as the IAB's TCF, their Transparency and Control Framework, we have issues with third-party cookies. Third-party cookies have been starting to be fed out for quite some time now, but now we can really see an end date. There won't be third-party cookies supported by almost any browser by the end of 2023. And again, that's put a lot of advertisers in a tricky position because now they have to find other ways of displaying adverts to their customers, and for publishers, they need a system to generate revenue for the things that they provide. And there are various solutions in the offing, but none of them have really taken hold at the moment. So it's kind of like a little bit of the Betamax VHS, if anybody's old enough to remember VCRs like that. You know, there'll be a bit of a battleground for the right online marketing system, and one will claim dominance in the end. Additionally, the ICO is going through some changes as well. So the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, now has a new commissioner, John Edwards. He's come over from New Zealand. And I think he's looking to implement a new strategy for the ICO as well. The previous regime under Elizabeth Denham got a lot of flack for looking only at very high-profile cases like government influence, and people like Cambridge Analytica, whereas John Edwards is much more focused on making things right for people and making it easier for businesses to get things right. Another thing that was being talked about in the previous session in the next room is the consultation that's been published by DCMS. DCMS is the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which oversees all of the creative industries, which includes marketing and data. And they're looking to overhaul the UK's data protection regime. It was Oliver Dowden who, in the introduction to this document said that data is now one of the most important resources in the world. Now that we have left the EU, we have the freedom to create a bold new data regime. Okay. Now, of course, this sort of worried a lot of people because we don't want to separate our data regime too much from that of the EU, because we currently have a data adequacy agreement, which means there's a free flow of data between the UK and the EU, which is vital to many businesses and to the way they work. So the last thing that anybody wants is for the UK to relax its data protection regulation to such a state that the EU would have to step in and say, you're no longer seen as being adequate with the EU, and they would remove that adequacy agreement.
What was an IAB and a TCF?
Sorry, the IAB is a trade association for internet advertisers, and the TCF is their transparency and control framework, which is a system that they use for communicating consent for cookies to all of the advertisers.
What did you, DCF, what did you, something framework? What did you say?
Transparency and control framework, or maybe transparency and consent framework, yes. Now, having looked at the DCMS consultation, there isn't really a huge amount in there that I can get particularly irate about. It's all very sensible stuff. There's a few things in there about reducing barriers to responsible innovation and reducing the burdens on businesses, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But some of the things appear to be change for change's sake. So, for example, what we understand under GDPR as data accountability, the government had received feedback from people suggesting that that was too onerous, and they were going to replace that with a privacy management framework, which seems to be just changing one thing for an equivalent other thing. But most importantly to me and to most marketers is the changes that they imposed on, or they intend to impose on legitimate interest. So legitimate interest is only one of the 6 legal bases with which you can use to process data, but it is probably the most useful one. And in a lot of cases, it needs to be sort of like the first one that you think of. Now, legitimate interest isn't as clear-cut as consent. Everybody understands consent. You tick a box, you say yes, that's it. Legitimate interest is a little bit more flexible, but it's the way that most processing behind the scenes is done. And there's been a lot of pressure against the use of legitimate interest from EU regulators, and certainly in the UK as well, there's been a lot of concern from organisations about using legitimate interest for processing data because they don't know whether they can fully rely on it. So what the government has proposed is that they will create a limited and exhaustive list of actual legitimate interests for which organisations can definitely use data without applying all the complicated balancing tests and legitimate interest assessments. So that will be a very positive thing when that comes out. There are other changes that I've listed there which are the kind of things that have been proposed, the removal of a legal requirement for a DPO, for example, but none of these things are really going to change the overall legislation regime particularly that much. If anybody wants to read that that consultation or the DMA's response to it, you can find that on our website. So as you can tell, there's a lot of things going on at the moment, a lot of different pieces of legislation and codes and best practice and what have you, all interacting together and causing a lot of confusion. I speak to a lot of marketers, and they often seem to be at a loss of where to go for the right answers, because there's just so much out there. So in an effort to try and clarify things, I've drawn up kind of like a hierarchy of laws and codes for people to work with. Now, clearly, at the top of the list, obviously, we have to have the law, right? So GDPR and the Data Protection Act 2018, which is all part of the UK law, I've put here. Now, that's an evolution of our existing data protection law, and we've dealt with that over the last few years of implementation. It's much more consumer-focused than previous data protection legislation. It's principles-based, as I said, and it's dealt with and enforced by the ICO. Directly under that, I've put PECRA because it's a much smaller piece of legislation when it comes to personal data, but it is vital to electronic communications. It's the UK interpretation of the EU's e-privacy directive, Now, as I said, there's a new new e-privacy currently going through the EU, but we don't really know when that will be finalised. Again, it's investigated and enforced by the ICO with much smaller fines than with GDPR. And of course, we don't quite know how the implementation of the new e-privacy in Europe will affect the UK's law. Next on the list, I've put the ICO's Code of Practice. When this is eventually published, this will have a legal standing and will sit just underneath the actual direct law as a code of practice. As I said, the current draft has a lot of unpopular decisions and leaves people with a kind of a do I, don't I concern about what to do. But we'll see the final version sometime this year, I'm sure. You can look up that code of practice because it is quite useful as a reference for many things. And the DMA's response to it, pointing out the things that we would like to have had changed. Again, they are both on our website. Next, we've got the industry codes, which, as I explained earlier, these are specialist GDPR-focused codes aimed at specific industries. So there aren't many of them that have been approved so far in the UK. I know that there's one out there for cloud computing, which is quite a nice niche. The DMA is trying to create one for direct marketing, which will cover quite a broad range of traditional direct marketing. And as I said, it will allow the ICO to delegate responsibility to that code owner, and they will do the investigation and enforcement on behalf of the regulator. At the bottom of the list here, I've got best practice guides. Now, the kind of best practice guides that the DMA create, these are really fantastic things, actually. They're excellent how-to guides produced by industry experts, and they focus on the practical use of marketing, not just the legal requirements. So they're excellent works for practitioners. And we've got a whole range of those on our website that anybody can get access to and learn the secrets of marketing from the professionals and the specialists that we have in membership. So where does that leave us? There's still so much going on. And even once you've managed to put that hierarchy in place, you're still not sure exactly where to go for the right information or which one to take notice of. There's quite a selection of different places to look for guidance, and sometimes it can be confusing. Sometimes you'll find, like I said, different interpretations or contradictions within some of those documents. So what I tried to do, in order to try and bring some order to the confusion that people were having, is to put the DMA code at the top of the hierarchy. Okay? The DMA code is an aspirational agreement to which all DMA members and their business partners must adhere. It provides an ethical framework for companies that want to do the right thing for their customer and their business. There was something that was mentioned in the earlier speech in the next room about not just being able to do it, but whether you should do it, okay? And often the law will allow you to do things which still make some marketers wince a little bit. There are plenty of things that people have done in the past to try and sort of come to grips with this. I know that there was one particular charity I used to do some work with. They used to have a policy that they called supporter in the room. So whenever they were sitting down and talking about their marketing data or their databases or their CRM, they would pretend that there was a supporter in the room. And if you can talk openly about the way that that person's data is going to be processed and used, knowing that that person's listening, then you're probably on the right track, right? This is an ethical approach to make sure that people continue to view data as information about individuals rather than just information which is an asset to the business. These are people that we're dealing with, and every piece of data affects them in some way. So when it comes to making decisions about personal data, and the answers aren't always easy to find, I often recommend that people go back to the code and use the principles of that code to steer them in the right direction. As I said, it provides an ethical framework for companies who want to do the right thing. At the heart of everything that we do at the DMA is our code of practice. And as you can see, data protection is not standing still. Okay, we're going through more changes than we've ever seen before. There's new technology, innovation, enforcement action, legal precedent, and political activity. And all of these things are influencing the way in which data is treated and what consumers think and how we interpret that legislation. The overarching principle of the DMA's code is to put your customer first, and we describe the code as a roadmap to trust. And trust, again, is another one of those issues which keeps coming up. It's vitally important to engender trust with consumers and the people that you do business with. It's one of those things that always comes up at the top of research when people say, you know, the kind of companies that they want to deal with. So I'll go back to the question that I asked at the beginning, which is, you know, what is the current state of play for data regulation? And it's uncertain. There's so much going on and so many ifs and buts all over the place that people don't really know what to do. So my recommendation is that if you're in doubt, refer to the code, and that will hopefully guide you in the right ethical direction. Because data these days is not all about legislation, it's about ethics as well. So that's all I've got to say on the subject of codes, but I'm happy to answer any questions from anybody about anything that I said, or anything else actually about data and marketing. If anybody's... Yes, please. Oh.
Thank you. My name's Victoria Roundtree and I work for Speakers for Schools, and we deal with a lot of children's data, and we would like to market to children. You said legitimate interest. I don't see marketing and legitimate interest apart from your soft opt-in. So how do you see that working together? Because we've just gone down the consent route because we're so scared of legitimate interest.
And this is exactly the point that the DMA have tried to make. People like consent because it's black and white. You know, it's either yes or they haven't said yes. Right? But actually, if you think about it, that's not always the best way. Now, setting aside the fact that it's children's data that you're talking about, because children, there are special rules for children, but in a general marketing sense, if you're asking somebody to consent, you're putting all of the responsibility onto them, okay? You have to, you know, for somebody to genuinely consent, they have to read the privacy policy, they have to understand, they need to know what you're doing with their data, and all of that responsibility is falling on the individual. If you use legitimate interest, what you're saying is that we've done that for you. We've taken on the burden of understanding our data processing, and we believe that it's perfectly legitimate, and that we will, you know, we'll stand by that. You know, it'll be scrutinized by a regulator if it's seen not to be that way. So a consumer can rely on the fact that you've done all of that work and you've done a legitimate interest assessment to justify that. And you can use legitimate interest for much more than soft opt-in, for example. So soft opt-in is a good one, and that's one of the things that will hopefully be expanded when the government launch the final version of its consultation, because that can't be used by charities or political parties, non-commercial bodies at the moment. So the soft opt-in will likely be expanded. But certainly for traditional channels like telephone and direct mail, legitimate interest should really be the first choice option. They're not particularly intrusive, and you know, everybody's got the right to opt out at any stage. And of course, there are things in place like the mailing preference service and the telephone preference service, which cover those channels as well. So having an opt-out for direct mail and using legitimate interest would be perfectly okay. As well as the soft opt-in for people that have actually bought something or entered into negotiation with you for email and SMS. But it's not just the sending of the marketing that requires a legal basis. All of the work that you do in the background, the storage of the data, the profiling, the selection, all of that kind of thing, you need a legal basis for all of those as well. And obviously legitimate interest is often the best one for that, because you don't want to ask people to consent to have their data selected from the database and that kind of thing. So in a way, legitimate interest should be the first choice. And if legitimate interest doesn't work, then you would move to consent. And that's something that we've been trying to promote through the DMA for quite some time. legitimate interest is a lot more flexible for people to use. There are significant differences, obviously, in the legal definitions and how they're treated, but it is still the best one for most marketing activities.
Is there any advice you would give regarding handling freedom of information requests?
I can't talk too much about freedom of information requests. That is something that's governed by the ICO, and they have a whole section that deals with that. But I'm afraid that's not my area. I'm not really.
I could just look it up on the ICO.
You could indeed, yeah. But freedom of information requests you can send to any sort of public body, and they have a duty to respond within a certain amount of time, unless you've asked for something which they have a very good reason for not giving you.
Hello. How successful do you think the IAB's appeal will be?
Well, look, if I'm brutally honest, I'm surprised the IAB's TCF has made it this far, right? I saw it when they launched it back in 2017 or whatever it was, and even then, I couldn't understand how it solved all of the GDPR problems. The transparency and control framework will gather a person's consent when they give consent for cookies, and they pass that consent down a chain to all of the people that are going to process that data in the ad tech stack. But there's so much more to GDPR than just saying that somebody has consent. What if somebody wanted to withdraw their data, or do a subject access request, or restrict processing? It's actually impossible to find out exactly where all the data has gone, or to all of the companies that the data has been sent when it goes through the real-time bidding process with online advertising. So to me, it doesn't really solve the whole solution. And there are now a number of alternatives being suggested to the traditional real-time bidding, contextual stuff, for example, and the things that Google is working on in its sandbox, which I think will overtake it eventually.
It's like being on BBC Sport, isn't it? Assuming consumer apathy, so my name's Fiona, all views are my own, right? They're representative of the organisation I work for. So assuming consumer apathy, right? I don't care about cookies, I press it, right? Why isn't there a move in the DMA or any other organisations, charity sector, etc., to get ISO 2007 certification and prove to the consumer that your technical and organisational measures are safe and secure?
Well, I would certainly recommend getting an ISO standard, and that's fine.
Or Cyber Essentials. Or
Cyber Essentials, and most companies have these things, but they will still, well, certainly most companies have Cyber Essentials. Not everybody has ISO, but even the ones that have ISO will still engage in online advertising, real-time bidding, that kind of thing, and they'll justify it in their ISO somewhere along the line. The thing that's really drawn attention to the use of cookies, it's almost like the technology ran away with itself. It was unchecked for a number of years, and it came to this crunch point where people suddenly realized that what was being distributed in the real-time bidding process was vast amounts of personal data where companies could build very complex profiles about every individual and help target very precise advertising to these people. But it's really quite a sinister way of dealing with data. As the legislation evolved, it's basically forced companies to throw up these consent banners every time you go to a website. And those are really annoying. Nobody really wants to deal with those. So the way that companies are dealing with that at the moment is to actually remove third-party cookies. So you'll know, if you've got an Apple device, you'll know that they don't support third-party cookies anymore. Google is going to phase out the use of third-party cookies in the next 12 months or so. And user privacy is a much bigger issue for these tech companies. You'll see adverts for Apple sort of promoting their products, saying that they're safe and and will protect your data. So in a way, it's quite interesting that the real change is being driven by the companies rather than being forced by the legislation. And eventually, what will happen is when nobody supports third-party cookies anymore, none of that data leakage that happens, or the indiscriminate distribution of data, that just won't happen anymore. And you'll be left with much more sensible solutions like contextual advertising or the Google topics solution, for example, which doesn't necessarily use... Well, it was more of a data breach, really. Yes, that's true.
Marketing sold it with a view to improving how we market. It's a business decision. It's not a leak.
Yes. So, yes, all of the changes being made by companies like this are obviously for their own benefit. Not
What I would say, as a consumer and DMA, if you've got Cyber Essentials or ones that have a topic on the website,
yes.
give you more satisfaction
Credibility.
to the consumer rather than pressing the type of
Cool. Okay. That's time. Thank you.